So, without further ado, I'm going to pass this on to Hayden.
Yes, well, thank you, Farrell. It's great to be here again. Those of you who were here last year remember I was the author guest of honor last year, but there's been a significant upgrade. But I'm here as the editor guest of honor, I guess because I'm now the publisher of Bundoran Press. We're in the dealer's room. And I'm happy to say there's quite a few Bundoran authors in attendance at the con this year, including Tom Barlow. Tom, raise your hand. Tom, Tom drove all the way up from Columbus, Ohio today. Wow. And, so I think you should be very impressed that he wants to be part of this as well. And we're going to have a great time tomorrow night when I launch his book, I'll Meet You Yesterday. And it's a great book, and I'm very proud to be launching it. Last year, as you may recall, my little speech was, well, somewhat amusing. I'm going to try and continue in that vein tonight. I did not bring my sarcasm sign. I seriously thought that I probably didn't need that again this year. I have had it tattooed to my finger. So if I feel like I need to be sarcastic with you, I'm not being rude. I'm just being sarcastic. One of the things that we talked about last year was the cutting edge of science fiction. So I decided that I would talk about the cutting edge of editing and publishing. Because being in it now for 10 months, everything is cutting edge to me. So things have changed. One of the great things now about publishing is we no longer get submissions in crayon. Electronic submissions, we just get weird, unreadable fonts, often in color. But that's okay, because we can just select all and change it to something we can read before we reject it. Now, I remember hearing Gardner Dozois, the great editor of Asimov's and of World's Best Science Fiction for many, many years, suggest to writers that instead of attaching a stamped self-addressed envelope, that they should just put a dollar bill to their story submission, for return postage. And we can't do that anymore, because with electronic submissions, there's no way to transmit it. But I'm thinking of putting up a tip jar, a PayPal tip jar on our submissions page. That might be the equivalent of that dollar bill.
Take PayPal.
Oh, yeah, PayPal, that's right.
Yeah, or Bitcoin.
Well, you would. But there are some. Believe it or not, there's still some magazines that only take mail submissions. Fantasy and science fiction, for example, only takes mail submissions. And I think the reason it's true.
Gordon gets accused of being sexist all the time. I'm reading that as M-A-L-E.
No.
It has been said online.
Mail.
I know. Yes.
By mail, postal, going postal with Gordon Kelder. And I'm thinking that maybe that's just a bizarre form of quality control. It's like, because it used to be that if you had to mail your submission, you had to put it in the mail, pay the postage, go to the post office, wait for it. You had to seriously want to be published or be seriously deranged. Now you can submit on a whim and you only have to be slightly disturbed. It's great. So these things have changed. And the other thing I found too is that people used to submit stories that were filled with grammatical errors, filled with spelling mistakes, but they didn't really know that was the problem. They didn't understand that this was a flaw with the writing. Now I get submissions where people actually take pride. They brag that weird punctuation is a creative choice. It's still unreadable, but it's a creative choice. So this is good. And the other thing that's changed too is that there used to be traditional publishers, and then there were vanity presses who preyed on the innocent. Now, there's the whole gamut. There's traditional publishers, there are self-publishers, there are indie publishers, and of course there are vanity publishers who prey on the innocent. And the difficulty is, now that Simon & Schuster's in the business, who can tell the difference? Boom! Boom. Anyone from Simon & Schuster here? No, that's good.
No, David used to be.
A long time ago.
Okay.
In a galaxy far, far away.
And they named it.
Yeah. The other thing too is, of course, we used to just get a covering letter and a submission. Now we get cover art, marketing advice, budgets. It's amazing. Again, all reasons to reject things. So So things have changed. The slush pile, for example, has been outsourced to the public. That's what self-publishing really is about. You go out, if you do really well, then traditional publishers come in and swoop you up. I even have that myself. People say, I've self-published, and they send me their self-published thing, but then they say, I only sold 8 copies. And so, it doesn't really make me want to become the traditional publisher who swoops them up. 80 copies, now that would be different. Okay, there are things about publishing that have not changed at all. One is satire is not as funny as you think it is. And telling someone a story is funny is not the same as making them laugh. I get these incredible cover letters, people telling me how funny their work is, or how thrilling or emotional, and I say, well, that's nice, but put it in the book. So, the other thing that hasn't changed is that nobody but your mom cares that you have 3 incredible cats, and that your writing is the bestest ever. So you have to put it in the books. So I'm just going to say that the things that haven't changed is that what publishing is about, what editing is about, what it's all about is telling the best possible stories you can, telling them as well as you can, getting all of those technical details right, and not expect a poor, beleaguered editor to see through all the grammatical problems and writing problems. So you need to do that as a writer in order to reach an editor so that we can love your book as much as you do and bring it to people who will love it even more. And the final thing I will say about editing and publishing that hasn't changed or that should never change, my philosophy and why I bought Bunner & Press, is I believe money should always flow to the writer. And that's what I try and do, is make sure that writers get paid first, and that I then go out and sell their books so we can all get paid. So, thank you very much.
You're very kind. October 4th, 1957 was the dawn of the Space Age. And it also was the day that Leave It to Beaver premiered. So we have the 2 things that have defined my career. An interest in space and science and an interest in pop culture both have signal anniversaries today. But that's not what I want to talk about. I've been wondering all week what I'm going to talk about. And finally it occurred to me. And the unfortunate reality is that this convention has multiple tracks of programming. And Matthew Johnson is in another room right now. Matthew Johnson is the current Canadian Regional Director of the Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers of America. He will also be the last Canadian Regional Director of the Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers of America, because in the recent bylaw reorganization, the organization is reincorporated in a new state, the notion of geographic regional directors has been abolished. Now, Matt, who is here, lives in Ottawa, published by Bunner & Press, my former writing student from the University of Toronto, wonderful fellow, will be the final Canadian Regional Director. And I was the first Canadian Regional Director. In 1992, Robin Wayne Bailey approached me at a SFWA event to say, hey Rob, I, Robin Bailey, am the Southwest Regional Director of the Science Fiction Writers of America, as it was called at that point. We hadn't let fantasy in through the back door because we hadn't realized that it was going to take off. Well, fantasy did take off and buried science fiction ultimately. And out of the goodness of their heart, they let us have SF at the beginning of the name instead of moving us down. Fantasy Writers of America, plus a few guys who still do science fiction, which is the real name of the organization. But Robin said, I'm the Southwest Regional Director, and looking over my job description, it says, responsible for this, and the Canadians. And he said, you know, I'm not really big on geography, but I'm pretty sure Canada is neither south nor west of the United States. And I don't know anything about what's happening in Canadian science fiction publishing. And I think there should be a Canadian Regional Director of SFWA. And would you spearhead the movement to get that established? And in a decision that I rue to this day, I said, yes, I'll get involved with SFWA politics, and did, and ultimately became president. Robin also served as president. But before I was president, I spent 3 years under 3 different administrations, ultimately ending up under Ben Bova's administration, pushing for the establishment of the Canadian region, the Science Fiction Writers of America, when other people like Jerry Pournelle were pushing back, pointing out repeatedly, loudly, and very, very often that California has a bigger population than Canada, which is true, and that California doesn't have its own region in SFWA, which is also true. But what wasn't true was that California had a different publishing environment than the rest of the United States. In 1992, we had a case that could be made, and we made it for 3 years. I and the others who were working to get this established made this case that there were things happening in Canada that this American-based organization wasn't prepared to deal with. There were things like On Spec magazine. 1992, On Spec was just 5 years old and founded, sorry, was just 3 years old, founded in 1989. The Tesseract anthologies, I think we were up to maybe number 4 by that point. Carolyn, my wife, and I edited number 6 ultimately in that series. Number 17 is available at Hayden's table in the dealer's room. But that was about the only case we could make. Well, we've got Tesseract books, Candace Jane Dorsey running this little company called Tesseract, which hadn't yet sold. Brian Hades hadn't emerged from the scene, and we had this one magazine. And maybe we needed a region to deal with the special issues. And there were a few other special issues, including, of course, that in Canada, there's government funding for the arts. And as some of you know, this incredible fluorescence of things happening in this country. The fact that this conference that Jim and Farrell began, CanCon, which is a nice little short name, but if you've ever read the other side of the colon, it is the Conference on Canadian Content in Speculative Arts and Literature, which is sounds like a grandiose name until you start enumerating all the things that fall under that rubric. We have a very vigorous Canadian science fiction and fantasy industry these days. In the interim, from that point in '92 when we started trying to establish a Canadian region, we saw, of course, in '94, the World Science Fiction Convention being in Winnipeg, Manitoba, David Hartwell and Glenn Grant editing an anthology for Tor Books, for a US publisher called Northern Stars, the Canadian science fiction anthology, that showed to an American audience that there was, in fact, a lot of Canadians writing science fiction, and good science fiction. Out of that anthology, David acquired a number of authors, and a few other authors were acquired by other editors at Tor. Candace Jane Dorsey, Eve Maynard, who I just saw, is Eve in the room here? I just saw Eve with his girlfriend. I would be with her too now, rather than listening to my boring speech, given a choice. Joël Champetier, Candace Jane Dorsey, myself, of course, Carl Schrader, Donna McMahon was published by Tor, and Robert Charles Wilson, of course, under Patrick Nielsen Hayden, who had his own Toronto connection, having lived in Toronto for a number of years. Patrick did in the early 1980s.